So welcome everyone. Hi, I'm Johnny Zukovich. I'm the Executive Director of Pax Christi USA, and we're glad to have you here for our Advancing Nonviolence Study Circles, our second of our 5 sessions with our panels to discuss different parts of the book. We are so grateful again for all the people that are participating in the study circle. We have over 200 people registered, and we're glad that you can make it tonight to be with us, or today to be with us, or tonight, depending on if you're in London like Pat is. So on today's call during the panel discussion, all participants will be muted with the exception of our moderator and panelists. You can submit questions for the panelists in the chat function. We also want to let everyone know that today's event is being recorded and will be posted later to watch on our YouTube channel and on the Pax Christi USA website. So the first hour of our time today will be spent watching a short video called Defining Nonviolence, which features several of the practitioners of nonviolence mentioned in the reading of part 1 of our book. And secondly, during that first hour, we'll be hearing from today's panelists as we dive deeper into themes and stories which defined this part of the book and explore how examples from around the world are demonstrating the Church's rediscovery of nonviolence. Our second hour, like last week, will be spent in breakout rooms where you will be able to discuss and share your own insights from reading part 1, as well as what you heard from today's panelists. The packets that you received as participants in the study circles contain suggested questions for this section, and you can refer to those as well as the more general questions that I sent to you in yesterday's reminder email to help start and to foster your discussions when you're in the breakout rooms. So the short film that we're about to watch is called Defining Nonviolence, and it was prepared by the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, a project of Pax Christi International. And it includes 3 of the people who were featured in the stories from part 1 of the book, as well as Jean-Baptiste Talat, one of our panelists who is here with us today. So in just a second here, I'm going to go ahead and start that video.
It's a normal experience of people day-to-day living, that violence is part of their day-to-day living. And it's also in Pikit where I have had a glimpse of how communities and individuals have been able to actually overcome that. And that to me is nonviolence. It's really a decision. It's an action of really overcoming violence. So it's not avoiding violence. It's not accommodating violence. It's being able to find creative ways to stop the cycle of violence.
A violent campaign is not the way to go, and it does not bring forward development movement in Fiji. And to state that the non-violent campaign is the better way to go.
Non-violence is I can say that it's the way how we live as Palestinians nowadays. We know that we are in a big prison, but still we are acting in a non-violent way. Sometimes I feel that we are crazy. I feel it.
I define non-violence as actually creative love. My sense of non-violence is really shaped by Christian conviction, my Christian conviction. So I can imagine some people, non-violence is just a kind of saying no to violence. But for me, it's connected with the way that I understand the story of God and how this is how God creates, redeems, and saves the world in a way that draws the whole of creation into God's creative love, act of love. So it is within that broader understanding of what God is doing, saying no to the use of force, physical force, or violence.
Nonviolence for me is either a way of life, or a principle, something that you actually believe in and live. That's one aspect. But another, Tom, will be it can be a tool, for political and social change. So it's for me the refusal to do harm. Because you believe that life is an absolute value. You believe that there's potential in every person to change. That belief, of possible conversion, of possible change in their aggressive dispositions or beliefs. So the aim of nonviolence is actually to liberate both the oppressor and the oppressed.
Nonviolence is intervening in those kinds of settings, and both if it is personal to, in whatever way possible, to stand in that place, that muddled mess, that tension, and give some witness to the possibility of resolution or reconciliation or peace. Sometimes with our work, it's de-escalating first and then just listening to people, giving them that sense of, even in their heightened, agitated state, they're worthwhile, they're human persons. And those acts usually come from someplace, and making room for the trauma, that hurt, that pain to be expressed and honored. For systems, it's speaking up and not keeping quiet when those in power or have a position do or say things that harm or lessen a human person.
I define nonviolence as repair. And the word reparations is connected to the word repair because nonviolence has a way of operating in the present that also pays attention to what has happened in the past with also a vision for the future. And so repair thinks about rejoining, not unlike religio, to bind together, to rejoin, to relink, to repair. And so I find nonviolent action, which can happen at any number of levels in society, its strongest when it's thinking about the past, present, and future and what repair means.
Nonviolence is a way of life. A way of life really that recognizes that all of us as human beings, we have values. And when you can focus on these values, you understand that you cannot destroy others' values. And you become someone who is engaged on promoting values as self in your group, and even in other group, even the group that you view them as your own enemies.
I define nonviolence as a way of relating to ourselves, to others, to God, to creation, in a way that's life-giving, that is, in Christian terms, is helping to build that kingdom of God, the beloved community that celebrates our relationships and our belovedness and the belovedness that we have to each other.
The many ways we can see active nonviolence, we arrived and reproduced the idea that in a very deep sense, it means how to being able to have a due disobedience to inhuman orders. This is it's the more complex idea that we try to reproduce in direct action in philosophy, spirituality, and daily life.
So folks, after seeing that short film and hearing some of those definitions around nonviolence, we're really excited to have with us today three panelists who can speak to our experience in reading the book and to deepen what we read in those pages. Our panelists today are Pat Gaffney, a peace activist and campaigner for more than 40 years, and after initially being a teacher, Pat went on to work with the Catholic aid agency CAFOD, setting up their schools education program before taking on the role of coordinator for Pax Christi England and Wales in 1990. In Pat's 30 years with Pax Christi, she has been a leader, an educator, and a campaigner working at national and international levels. And she's a member of the executive committee of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. And with Rose Berger, who we'll see on one of our later panels, she helped to convene working groups and roundtables for this project. Our second panelist is Jean-Baptiste Tala. He is the technical advisor for peace building and justice in Africa and has served with Catholic Relief Services for more than 20 years. Prior to joining CRS, Jean-Baptiste was a regional advisor for education in his home country of Cameroon and has served as the coordinator for the Justice and Peace Commission of the Association of Episcopal Conferences in the Central Africa region. Over his career, Jean-Baptiste has facilitated hundreds of peace-building training workshops from the grassroots to the highest levels of government and civil society. He is particularly instrumental in supporting the efforts of the Church, Caritas, and Catholic Relief Services country programs to advance social cohesion and reconciliation. And as you remember, both Pat and Jean-Baptiste were contributors to the book that we're reading. Our third panelist, Ken Budigan, teaches in the Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies program and the Catholic Studies Department at DePaul University in Chicago. He is a strategist for Pace Bene's campaign Nonviolence, which advances active nonviolence through training and action. He has worked in a series of movements for social change, including struggles addressing homelessness, nuclear weapons, freedom for East Timor, peace and justice in Central America, and the US wars in Iraq. Ken serves on the executive committee of Pax Christi International's Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, and he is one of the primary editors of our book. So welcome Ken, Pat, and Jean-Baptiste, and thanks for joining us today for today's panel discussion. So the way that we'll do this is I'm just going to moderate by starting off with a couple of questions, and I'm going to direct them to each of you individually. But if there's any of these questions that I direct to one of you, but another person would also like to answer, we certainly have time and the space to do that. So Ken, as one of the main editors of the book, I want to start with my first question for you. In the introduction to part 1, the book begins with the premise that a number of factors within the teaching and practice of the Catholic Church point to the rediscovery of the central place in the life and mission of Jesus. Now, this rediscovery is rooted in the understanding that Jesus was, of course, nonviolent. But why describe this as a rediscovery? How has this aspect of Jesus's nonviolence been marginalized over the centuries? I just need you to unmute there, Ken.
Johnny, thank you so much for this opportunity for all of us to engage with a very, very important question. And to me, that question is, can our future be more nonviolent than our past? I believe it can be. And I think that the church can play an important role in it if it fully embraces its call to the nonviolent life. The theology and practice of nonviolence are at the core of the gospel. Nonviolence combines a thoroughgoing rejection of violence with unconditional love. It's these two hands of nonviolence. On the one hand, I will not cooperate with your injustice, with this violence. And then on the other, I'm open to you as a human being. Nonviolence is a spirituality, a way of life, a strategy for changing the world, and a universal ethic. Nonviolence, in thinking about it, violence is justice for some, and nonviolence is justice for all. It is, as Dr. King said, the love that does justice. So in answering your question, Johnny, I first want to lift up some of the words of one of the persons who was on this video, Father Emmanuel Katongole, who teaches at Notre Dame, but is a priest in Uganda, and who was with us at the 2019 conference on nonviolence at the Vatican. And here's what Father Katongole has to say about nonviolence. Nonviolence is a calling because it is the way of God. It is the way God creates, governs, and redeems the universe. And this is very odd, that a powerful God would suffer and die on the cross, that God would respond to evil through love. It doesn't make sense, but this is the way of Christ. It's not simply a pious exhortation, it's an invitation into a social vision that allows the construction of true and durable peace, a vision of society not founded on war and violence, but on God's self-sacrificing love. Well, this caught the imagination of people in the first century who faced a huge amount of violence and oppression. And this was this idea that this counterintuitive vision that we're called not to be caught in the trap of violence, a victim of that trap or a perpetrator of that trap. We're called to dissolve the trap, not by avoiding violence or going along with violence or using violence ourselves, but through that excess of love. And we call this nonviolence because it's a clear stand against violence. So to your question, Christianity at various points lost its way, beginning with the bargain it struck with the Roman Empire in the 4th century. It's sort of like, it'd be like Gandhians in a few centuries that are totally for oppression and violence and militarism. But the good news is that nonviolence was never extinguished. And it is emerging in a powerful and vibrant way in our own time. Why? Because this Kairos moment, this moment of decision and opportunity, prompted by, I believe, the Holy Spirit, requires nothing less than a profound recommitment to Jesus's nonviolence in order to heal the planet and to end the scourge of white supremacy, economic inequity, gender violence, and many other forms of domination and dehumanization. And so I look forward to the opportunity for all of us to reflect and maybe even more importantly, move forward on bringing this active, creative, liberating nonviolence forward in a way that perhaps for centuries it hasn't been.
Thanks, Ken. And just maybe to follow up with that, and Pat, I'm going to direct this question specifically to you. You know, in your introduction, it mentioned that, you know, you've been doing this work for 30 years with Pax Christi in England and Wales, and Ken just talked about a sort of reemergence of nonviolence. You know, over the arc of your own career, would you say that reality bears out, that you see that, you know, over the decades, there's a sort of a blooming of interest in nonviolence, you know, within Pax Christi, within the larger church, that's happened over the time that you've been involved?
Yes, can I just, to my Irish friends, this is green, friends, it's not blue. so I'm not offending anyone. Yes, I think that flow and flourishing of nonviolence, it's not just been in the last 30 years. I think it's well beyond that in England and Wales. If I look at many of the social movements, secular movements, to do with land, to do with women, to do with property, many of them have been inspired by the kind of direction of nonviolence. I think the things that limit the flourishing of this growth of nonviolence have to do with one of the phrases Pietro used, and he talked about, he talked about the disobediences of human order, that nonviolence has to be that, has to do that. And I think when one starts to look at how we put that into practice, into looking at where human order needs to, where we have to pay attention to it, when it's, as Ken says, when it's damaging, when it's diminishing, when it's destroying, quite often we're disobeying the status quo, we're disobeying legal systems, we're disobeying economic systems. And our churches, certainly here in England and Wales, they really don't like that. And I think that's a huge hurdle that we still have to overcome. The gap between what the gospel offers, what Jesus as a person offers, the gap between what Francis is now offering and what's happening in our national churches is tragically enormous. So there is a movement, there are people, there are traditions, there are stories to be told that are making an impact, but the institution is still wary, I think, of that.
Thanks, Pat. And when you talk about those stories that are making an impact, one of the things that was really obvious in the book is that this first part of the book was given over to 7 stories that demonstrate the way that various actors within the church are employing nonviolence in situations of conflict. And one of the stories is specifically about your work, Jean-Baptiste, the work that you've done in the Central African Republic. So I was just wondering, can you develop for us a little more of this notion of social cohesion? You talked about that also in your introduction, the notion of social cohesion, how it's fostered in your work to transform conflict, how it's a demonstration of active nonviolence. Come back to you.
Thank you again to give me this opportunity to participate to this roundtable. First, let me come back to the first question you asked. And for that first question, really, I believe that to rediscover is to remove the lid on a reality that has remained hiding for the second time. And I believe the church all his life have been trying in its own way to save life. And this has always been central to church work. But sometimes due to the fact that due to how we are, they find immediate solution like just peace, another way to save life. But I still believe that today we are discovering that if you keep quiet in face of injustice, you are going to be his complice. And so to act and to fight violence without being violent yourself, without being converted to the evil, you need to look for non-violence. And this is a discovery. That means really reaffirming the known way of living and the known way of preaching of Jesus that he discovered the first time. And we have also have an opportunity to discover this working in many countries in Africa. I can't even say the number of countries, but as you rightly say, I'm going to stick on the example of Central African Republic. You asked me to say something about social cohesion. The social cohesion evokes togetherness, solidarity, trusted and tolerant community, living in a just and equitable environment, both horizontally and vertically. When I say that, this can seem very utopist, especially in this world where we have competition of power, where we have discrimination, where we have all what you are experimenting now in your own country, in the United States. But working in Central Africa brought me to think that hope is there. And that this hope is based on having a positive perception on yourself, on others. As you really say it, since 2013, I have been accompanying religious leaders in Central African Republic to try to contribute in rebuilding a better society in a midst of violent conflict that jeopardize the society in Central African Republic. And just a bit of stories, a bit of history on this country. In Central African Republic, Years of misrule and neglect had created deep fissure among various groups, being ethnic, religious, and politics. And the situation worsened in 2012, between 2012 and 2013, when a group of people called Seleka, who was rebels, but most of them were Muslims, they decided to overthrow out of power the leader of the country. And when they arrived, they were even supported by others who felt excluded from the society. Unfortunately, they succeeded to throw away the one who was in power at that moment, but they become also very violent. And they started destroying people's property and focus on target most churches or most Christians' infrastructure. And this provoked another group called Anti-Balaka, who are sometimes more close to Christians. And this Anti-Balaka group people also started fighting Seleka. And when they started, it was on behalf of the people, because most of the time people say we are fighting on the behalf of the people. But they become even violent against their own people. And this creates a chaotic situation in Central Africa. And in that mix, we were very fortunate at CRS to be invited by the church, by local church, to provide support to them. And when we arrived, we discovered that people who have gone through violence, people who have gone through all this situation, most of them have a negative perception of themselves or a negative perception of those who are around them. And because the life is not valued, they believe that they can also take other people's life. And we discovered that most of the people who give into violence are people who feel that they are excluded for the society. They feel that they are not important. They feel that they are not respected, and they decide to do it. But when I was doing that, I discovered an approach that was very key. Is the appreciative inquiry, which stipulate that good, good relationship is built where you have a positive perception of yourself. And what we started trying to do, it was to bring people to help people to start having good perception of themselves, having good perception, positive perception of those around them. And at the same moment, we discovered an approach that was in practice in Philippines. Our colleagues in Philippines was using an approach that they call the 3B. With the 3B, they believe that the change should start by yourself. You know, the only person on which you can have really influence is yourself. To the other, you can give advice. But if you want to change, you have to be the change you want to. So there is a way. The first B is binding, and binding is focus of self-transformation. And the second B is bonding. And bonding is transformation in your own group. Because if you can bring this transformation you have in your own group, then you can lay down, you can set the scene for collaboration with others. And the first B is breeding. That means breeding, having breedings with others and together to build trust. So in Central African Republic, we combine the 3 Bs, the 4D. The 4D is really the 4 pillars of the appreciative inquiry. And the first one being discover. That means bringing people to discover that even if they are going through all this, they're still human beings. They still have value. They still have goals that they can provide to the society to be rebuilt. And we discovered that when people have that sense, when they change their mind and started thinking that I'm still a human being, it changed a lot in their own life and they decide to do things differently. And when you discover that you still have value, you can then dream. And this is the second D. Dreaming is to think about a positive way of living with others. And when you dream, you need to design. That means to analyze and see what are the factors, what are things that can be improved to help me realize my dream. And when you design, you need to deliver. That means to realize your dreams. Those are the 4D. So we combine the 4D and the 3B, bringing people to start by thinking on self, then thinking as a group, and bridge with others. And you ask me how this is linked to non-violence. We discovered that by doing this, it disarms people's hearts. People who were already really, let me not share very quickly. I remember a priest during a workshop who shared with us the fact that he has decided to kill. Due to what he has gone through, he was looking for gun. And when he was going to have gun, the first person he was going to kill was a Muslim. But after the workshop, he said, please, he started crying, please pray for me. I want to become again a human being, not to kill. And by doing this, we succeed to bring religious leaders, Catholic, Protestant, and Muslim to come together and to preach peace. Because of time, I cannot give a lot of examples, but we discovered that when you testify this love of Jesus, the love without borders with people around you, you can change people, even armed people. With bishop and Muslim imams, we succeed in having meeting with armed groups. And with each armed group who went through the process, some of them at the end say, I'm going to put down my gun and started working for peace. So the approach we were using really, for me, was a testimony that there is an alternative way to violence that is in our world. And this alternative way is to provide non-violent response to the situation that is happening, to fight people with arms without arms. And this can really help us to change the world in which we are. So this is what I can share regarding your question. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Jean. Yeah, it seems very much that the sort of the ground that needed to be seeded, as you talked about, was a sense of returning people to their own sense of dignity, and then a recognition of the dignity of other folks. And that seemed to be a common theme in some of the stories that were contained in this part of the book. And I wanted to ask Pat and Ken, both of you were involved in helping to edit or to curate the stories that are used in this section of the book. Was there a particular challenge or insight from any of them, or was there a common thread throughout all of them that you'd like to hold up or highlight for us to expand on a little bit?
I'll kick off and then Ken can come in. I was with Rose, I facilitated the group that worked for a year to distill these stories and bring them into this wonderful publication. And just a few threads I wanted to kind of pull out that I think are present in all of them and also in the videos we saw. One is an understanding that non-violence is about persistence, and it's about a long haul journey that people engage in, and it's about deep change. And that all that's quite demanding on individuals and on communities. So what we also learned from our stories is that people create communities of non-violent change. They don't do it on their own. And that to me was an important learning and perception from those stories. A second one to me was that the process that these people were using and articulating was really highlighting the role of inclusiveness, whether it was, as Jean-Baptiste explained, bringing people of different faiths into dialogue and work for change, whether it's bringing men and women, whether it's bringing settled people with refugees and migrants, asylum seekers, but inclusive of the community that's experiencing the violence and that might be part of the solution and part of the change. So that's a second model. And the third thing that really struck me in many of the case stories and in the people, the nature of the people, was the creativity. Non-violence brings out creativity and it demands it, I think. So to tap into culture, to song, to art, traditions, to sports, to games, as both a way of surfacing fears or concerns, but then maybe also bringing people together to explore ways forward. So they're more kind of to do with methods and strategies, but I think they're really important, and they're things that all of us will understand and all of us can embrace.
Thanks, Pat. Ken?
Well, I was so happy that you, Pat, and Rose, and Marie, Dennis, and others were so insistent on privileging and putting up front these stories. At the heart of nonviolence is story. It's how confronting violence and injustice, people have summoned the courage and creativity to make that change possible. And rereading these stories in the last few days, I did see a number of threads running through them that are lessons for us. The importance of agency rather than immobility. Nonviolence is not passive, it's not weak, it's not at the edges, it's really engaging. And you see so much powerful agency in each of these stories, mostly agency of women in these contexts. The second was the importance of drawing people closer together, that kind of social cohesion that Jean-Baptiste is talking about. Drawing closer together, including those who have been socially or historically separate or at odds or enemies. You see that theme again and again in these stories. The importance of sensitive support and listening, and then following the lead of those who are facing enormous violence. So I asked the question at the beginning of my reflection, can our future be more nonviolent than our past? And I believe it can be as we tell these stories, as we discover these stories, as we share these stories, as we listen for these stories. And so in all of our contexts, in London and Portland and in all the different places we are, Washington, D.C. and many other places, there are many, many stories. And so I'm grateful that those stories were featured in the book and that we're able to learn from them. But I encourage all of us, tell our stories of active, creative, liberating nonviolence.
Thanks, Ken. You mentioned two things there in your answer that sort of feed into the next question that I wanted to ask. You talked about how it is that groups and individuals on the ground in situations of conflict take the lead on the solutions, the nonviolent solutions that are necessary to address what they're experiencing. And you also talked about the agency specifically of women. And that's one of the two areas in this section of the book that are held up for special treatment. It's the impact and the experience of violence towards women and girls. And in hearing the stories from women at the conferences in Rome, at the, in curating, Pat, the stories for this book, what special influence do women have, who have known firsthand the impact of violence? What special influence do they have on the church's rediscovery and practice of nonviolence? And Pat, I'll ask that of you specifically. I think we might have lost Pat.
No, I'm here. The system went dead. So I didn't hear the question. Is this now relating to the women's question?
Yeah, exactly. I was just asking, especially, what special influence do women who have known firsthand the impact of violence, what do they have in terms of influence on the church's rediscovery and practice of nonviolence? And I'll try to find you here and spotlight you on.
I'm here. So don't worry. Well, again, just to begin with saying that the section in the book that deals with women, we begin with the reminder of the reality that the violence women face, through rape, forced prostitution, trafficking, rape as a weapon of war and a tactic that's used against women, gender violence. That's part of the reality in the world that we're living in. I think what's so encouraging is that, especially I would say in the last 6 months, globally, from Belarus to Mexico to the US to London to Afghanistan, Myanmar, the Philippines, we have seen women taking leads in challenging the lack of human rights, in working for democracy, in talking about racial justice issues and violence towards women. Women are taking the lead there. And what are they good at doing, and what could they be offering more to our church? And I'm going to draw Mary Yelnick's on the call, and she gave a wonderful presentation last week, and I want to draw on some of her ideas. And she reminded us how good women are at relationship building and what a feature that is of nonviolence and advocacy. Because when you're in relationship with people, you are including them in your circle of listening and learning from experiences. You're straddling different roles and different spheres, so you're in a good position to look at what's happening perhaps on the edges as well as the centre, and look out for warning signs or what needs attention, what's calling for our attention in communities. And all of that offers deeper insights into the way we may need to be facing incidents and acts of violence in our communities. I think women also have a great sort of sticking power, and we saw in the video Rania from Palestine.
I think Pat has frozen on us. We'll just see if she comes back here in a second. Okay. We'll see if Pat comes back with us and she can finish that thought. But maybe just while we're waiting for Pat to rejoin us, one of the previous panels that we had, Marie Dennis was one of the speakers on that. And one of the things that Marie suggested was how differently we might consider nonviolence if the investment in it was equivalent to the kind of investment that our society puts into militarized solutions. And the correlation there being that if given the resources, nonviolence is actually much more effective than violence. And Jean-Baptiste, I wanted to ask you specifically, because it sounds like the success of the program that you helped to run in the Central African Republic, it was due in large part because of the presence of strong Catholic institutions investing in that process. So I wanted to ask you is, how did the church's support help that work, the work of nonviolence, to succeed because they invested in it?
Okay. I was muted. I just wanted to unmute. Yeah, it's true that if we could have investment in nonviolence, I think the world can automatically change. But when we talk about resources, I believe the first resource are human. And in the case of Central African Republic, we were very fortunate to have church leaders who already, were transformed and who really wanted to build peace in their own country. And we discover how church is very powerful. We call it the convening power of the church. Mm-hmm. This really brought the church to bring us to meet with people at all levels, of the society, to have training with people at all levels of the society, so to have internal resource of people who could then contribute to peace. But for sure, we were fortunate to have USAID support, funding support in the programs. But I can tell you, the fact that we were working with church leaders, at the end of the first program we had, church leaders together with CRS mobilized other financial resource, internally and externally, to continue working for peace. And what I learned is that the great power church has is his capacity to create a space for dialogue. And I used to say his capacity to be some resource that is like the frame of the door. You know, the frame of the door is not in, is not out. And those who want to go in, pass through the frame. Those who want to go out, pass through the frame. I witnessed that in Central African Republic. Accompany the Archbishop, going and meet military, meet armed groups from different, without arms, speaking with them, sometimes providing with them food that came from parishes. And this really bring people to start thinking differently. So yes, the resources are there, but we need to think about internal resources, who most often are human, and what we bring out is not what transforms the situation, because if you have even financial resources, I don't have human resources, devoted human resources for change, things are not going to happen. So that's what I can share with you from our experience in Central African Republic.
Thanks, Jean-Baptiste. Yeah, that's an excellent point. And Ken, maybe you could follow up on that. And let me just reframe it just a little bit, because really, in some sense, the whole point of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, the point of this book, is to get the church to invest in nonviolence at every level. So I guess my question is, why hasn't there been more investment in terms of nonviolence, both in the church and in the world? And what can the church do to invest more deeply in nonviolence?
After the 2016 conference, I went to visit my pastor in my parish and explained this amazing effort that just had happened. And I said, why don't we become a pilot nonviolent parish? And he looked very puzzled. And I live in Chicago. And he said, oh, well, you mean something like that should happen on the south side of Chicago or on the west side of Chicago. That's where all the violence is. And he had totally missed the point that we are called, all of us, first of all, to give up our belief in violence, to find nonviolent strategies, to learn those developmentally all through our lives, and to have that within the church itself, saying, this is the core of our identity as Christians. This is the way Jesus really called us. This is how God calls us, as Father Katangale said, to live our lives together. And so our vision is that at every level of the church, we have the opportunity to, as we say, invest in people, in resources, in infrastructure, in training. If we invest in violence, we get violence. If we invest in nonviolence, we get nonviolent options. We get a paradigm of life. So I encourage, we're seeking to continually and respectfully ask Pope Francis and the Vatican to give that bold call for that kind of investment, but that can also happen wherever we are. For a while, I was with a movement we started called Catholics for Nonviolence in the Chicago Archdiocese, and we did 17 trainings on nonviolence. What was required was both grassroots work, but also support from the top. And we didn't always have that. We had the grassroots support. So we need both. I want us to imagine a century from now, we're looking back and we're seeing how the Catholic Church finally took seriously nonviolence and the impacts that it had over these centuries in terms of climate, in terms of economics, and in terms of racism, in terms of the gender violence that we heard about from Pat Gaffney. I wanted to say one more thing about women and nonviolence. I've taught maybe 200 workshops on nonviolence. Mostly women come to these trainings. They will occasionally drag a man along to the trainings who don't want to be there. But about halfway through the training, something happens. The light bulb goes on and they say, oh, I guess I've been kind of violent. But then the other light bulb goes on and says, I've actually been nonviolent in my own way. And by the end of the weekend workshop in the evaluation, they start saying, you people are thinking too small. We need a nonviolent army all across this country and so on. I just think that we need in the church, we need first of all, the patriarchy of the church needs to be met head on, and we need an engagement for this kind of all of us getting this kind of training, including men as well as women and children.
Thanks so much. And I believe Pat is back with us. So I'm going to ask Pat, Pat, you were just in the middle of answering your question again around the age of women. But I also want to just throw out to you one of the questions that we put in the chat box, which is if you're hopeful about the effectiveness of persistent nonviolent protests in Myanmar, which much of it is led by women. So I'll kick it over to you, Pat.
I'm very hopeful about women's impact and engagement. Myanmar is just one example, but in thinking about tonight, I was also thinking about other contemporary examples where women have really helped buy into peace processes in different contexts and how that's helped shift things. I think, for example, in our context, the whole context of Northern Ireland, it was when women really began to engage politically and socially in the peace process and said, we've had enough of the violence. And they challenged the old men of violence. That change started to happen. They were being listened to. People were paying attention to them. And that helped political, sorry.
Okay. Get a drink of water, Pat. I can direct a question to one of the other panelists. All right. Thank you so much, Pat. And I do want to share that you had mentioned Mary Jelinek talk with Pax Christi England and Wales, the workshop that she did. And we have shared it on our Pax Christi USA Facebook page. Folks are looking to be able to see that. I invite folks to take a look when they have a chance. So we've just got a minute or two left here for a couple questions, and there were a couple posted in the chat that I wanted to throw to each of you, and maybe we'll ask Jean-Baptiste you to go first. And I'm going to shorten the question a little bit. It's from Stephen Jackson from Illinois, and Stephen asks, how do we change a nation of violence and military superiority to a nation of nonviolent people? And I know that's a huge question. Maybe if I could ask each of our panelists to just give me like one action that you think, folks in their context, whether it's here in the United States or whether it's in a country in Africa or the UK, that if they want to do something to help change their own society, their own culture away from violence and military solution to nonviolence. Jean-Baptiste, what would be one thing that you would recommend?
Very quickly, there is a principle in peace building that say, go from key people to more people. It's first to identify key people, and key people are those who can influence because they are trusted by the society. And for the case I use, the case for Central African Republic, we were very fortunate to have the cardinal, the actual cardinal, an imam, and a pastor who were already trusted by the society, who decided to come together and to work for peace. And from those three people, we were able to touch, I can't remember the number of people who attended trainings that they convened, and we were just there to provide technical support. So at all levels, if you have good entry points, you can touch people at all levels. I remember even we had training with let's say with people at the government level, people from the government, people from the parliament, because of trusted people we had. But I saw another question, if you allow me, saying that we still have also violence in church. I saw this, but I just want to say, it's not easy. We have one of the key resources we have is the gospel and our Catholic teaching. And just a very quick sample. I was having a training with all the bishops in Central African Republic, and we were reflecting on how to accept others. But after the first night of the workshop, there was an attack in a church, and a priest was killed. And the next day, it became very difficult to the bishop to continue talking about accepting others. But fortunately, the same day, the reading of the day was saying, if you love just those who love you, what do you do differently than those who do not believe? And from that talk, it changed. And at the end, the bishop come again together and say, let us continue working for peace. Transformation is a long process. And for us, we used to say that it's a journey from our head to our heart. Bringing all the principles is no. All the teaching we have gone through, bring it out from our head and put it in our life and leave it with others. That is the journey. And all of us in the church, we are called for that journey. Back to you.
Thanks, Jean-Baptiste. And Pat, maybe if I could ask you if there's one thing that you would like to recommend about helping that transformation to happen.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
We can.
Yeah. I would keep it very simple, and I would say start a conversation. Because in all of these issues, I think about what matters to me, what am I passionate about, and how do I share that passion, and how do I help other people, see that what I'm involved in might matter to them as well. We have enough crises, we have enough problems, we have enough challenges in our own communities, never mind globally, to start a conversation about what we're seeing, what we feel, how it's impacting on us, what disturbs us. Start the conversation.
Thanks so much, Pat. And Ken, I'm going to go to you. We're getting quite a few questions in the chat right now, and unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our panel discussion together. So I'm going to ask you that same question, Ken. Again, what's one thing, and maybe you could help frame it too, in the idea of the overall hope in publishing this book and putting advancing nonviolence and just peace for the church and the world out there. If you could frame it, in terms of your hope for the book as well.
Thanks, Johnny. I'm very fortunate to teach students at DePaul University who are really the next generation. And what I find is over the course of a whole semester, one story after another of nonviolent transformation, healing, restorative justice, something goes on in their brains. And they say, I had no idea that I have more power than I think to make this change possible. The stories are critical. So we heard 7 stories in this book, Advancing Nonviolence. I challenge all of us to find the other 70 stories or 700 stories or 7,000 stories. Share them. It's very critical. It's very important. We were hoping with this book that we would offer a vision that talks theologically, ecclesiologically, philosophically, but also pastorally and practically about the power of active and creative nonviolent change. We do have more power than we think. And so we will not get through the 21st century unless we tap that power. So I invite all of us, tap this power, share what you've heard today, identify the stories in your own life and share those, and let us hear the story of active and creative nonviolence.
Great. Thanks so much, Ken. And Pat, Ken, and Jean-Baptiste, thank you to all of you for joining us today. We'll just give you a little clap, a round of Zoom applause for being with us today. We're grateful not only for your participation today, but really for everything that you're doing to reassert the primacy of nonviolence as a strategy for addressing conflict and transforming relationships. It's really much needed work, both here in the church and in the world. So thank you all very much for being with us.